The Wyoming winter of 1875 showed no mercy to anyone, especially not to Sarah Mitchell. Abandoned by her stagecoach in a raging blizzard, the young widow and schoolteacher had accepted that this might be her last night on Earth. Her fingers had gone numb, her legs wouldn't move anymore, and the howling wind drowned out her prayers. But then she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats cutting through the storm. Through the curtain of snow, a figure emerged on horseback, like an answer to her desperate prayers. She didn't know it yet, but this night would change everything. What starts as a desperate fight for survival could lead to something neither of them expected to find again: love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Earlier that morning, Sarah Mitchell's fingers had trembled for entirely different reasons as she pinned the children's artwork to the schoolhouse walls. The hand-drawn Christmas cards formed a cheerful parade of color against the rough-hewn logs, each one a treasure she'd missed during the 2-week break. Her silver locket clicked softly against the top button of her wool dress as she stretched to reach the higher spots, the familiar weight of Thomas's photograph inside pressing against her heart. "Mrs. Mitchell," little Emma Cooper's voice quivered from the doorway. "Do you really have to go visit your sister for Christmas?" Sarah turned to find all 12 of her students huddled in the entrance, their breath visible in the chilly morning air. She pressed her hands to her skirts, smoothing away the chalk dust and forcing a smile. "It's only for 2 weeks, dear ones. Miss Thompson will take good care of you until I return." But even as she spoke the words, something deep inside her chest tightened. 6 months a widow, and still every goodbye felt like echoes of that last morning with Thomas. He'd kissed her cheek, promised to be careful in the mine, and never came home. "We made you something special," announced Billy Thompson, the oldest student at 13. He nudged his younger sister forward. Mary clutched a carefully wrapped package to her chest, her eyes bright with anticipation. Sarah knelt to accept the gift, her throat tightening as she unwrapped a hand-bound book. Inside, each student had written a message and drawn a picture. On the first page, in Mary's careful script, "To the best teacher in Wyoming Territory, please come back to us." The morning passed in a blur of arithmetic lessons and Christmas carols, but Sarah's attention kept drifting to the growing darkness outside. Heavy clouds pressed against the windows, and the wind had picked up considerably since dawn. Mr. Cooper, dropping off fresh firewood, had mentioned seeing weather signs that concerned him. "Storms coming in faster than expected," he'd warned, glancing at the sky. "You sure about taking that afternoon stage? Might be safer to wait until tomorrow." But Sarah had already paid for her ticket, and her sister Catherine was expecting her. After losing Thomas, Catherine had been her rock, writing letters filled with gentle encouragement and practical advice. This visit was long overdue. As she dismissed the children early, their worried faces tugged at her heart. They hugged her fiercely, one by one, until only Emma remained, clutching Sarah's skirts. "Promise you'll come back," the child whispered. Sarah touched her locket, thinking of all the promises life had already broken. But she forced brightness into her voice. "Of course I will. We still have to finish Little Women, don't we?" After they left, Sarah stood alone in the schoolhouse, listening to the wind's growing howl. She packed her carpet bag with trembling hands, a change of clothes, Thomas's letters, her journal, and the children's gift book. The stagecoach would arrive soon, and she needed to be ready. Just before leaving, she paused at Thomas's old desk in the corner. He'd built it himself when she'd first taken the teaching position, proudly carrying it to the schoolhouse on his broad shoulders. "Every proper teacher needs a proper desk," he declared, his eyes twinkling with love and pride. Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth wood, remembering. The drawer still stuck slightly, just as it had the day he made it. Inside lay the Christmas gift she'd never given him, a fine fountain pen engraved with his initials. She'd been so excited to surprise him with it. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as she locked the schoolhouse door. Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter and hurried toward the stagecoach stop, trying to ignore the way the wind cut through her layers. The streets were nearly deserted now, most folks having heeded the weather warnings and headed home early. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mitchell women are made of stern stuff." She'd said it often during Sarah's childhood in Vermont, usually while teaching her daughters to face hardship with grace. Sarah lifted her chin against the strengthening wind. She was a Mitchell woman twice over now, by birth and by marriage, and she would not let a little snow deter her. Still, as she waited for the stage under the gathering storm, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on a journey far different from the one she'd planned. The stagecoach arrived late, its wheels already caked with wet snow. Sarah clutched her carpetbag closer as the driver, a weather-beaten man named Hank, secured her trunk alongside the others. Inside, 3 passengers regarded her with varying degrees of interest, a well-dressed couple who introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison from Boston, and a thin-faced man who merely nodded before returning to his newspaper. Sarah settled onto the hard bench beside Mrs. Harrison, who immediately wrinkled her nose at Sarah's wool dress. "Traveling alone, dear? How brave!" The word dripped with condescension. Sarah withdrew her leather-bound journal from her carpetbag, running her fingers over its worn cover. Thomas had given it to her on their first wedding anniversary, understanding her need to capture life in words. Now it held her private thoughts, her grief, her slow steps toward healing. She opened to a fresh page, hoping to lose herself in a writing rather than engage with her fellow passengers. The stage lurched forward, and Sarah watched through frosted windows as her small town disappeared into the swirling snow. Mrs. Harrison kept up a steady stream of complaints about the accommodations, while her husband offered occasional grunts of agreement. The quiet man with the newspaper turned out to be a banker named Edwards, traveling to Cheyenne on business. "Shouldn't be more than 6 hours to the next station," Hank called down through the roof hatch, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Long as this weather holds." But the weather wasn't holding. Sarah could feel it in the increasing sway of the coach, in the way the horses' hooves struggled for purchase on the increasingly treacherous ground. The wind found every crack and seam in the coach's construction, sending icy fingers down there. "Next," she wrote in her journal, "the storm grows fiercer with each mile. I cannot help but think of Thomas's last day, how the weather had seemed perfectly fine that morning." Her pencil skidded across the page as the coach hit a particularly deep rut. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Mrs. Harrison declared, clutching her husband's arm. "George, surely the driver doesn't intend to continue in these conditions?" The coach lurched again, and Sarah's pencil went flying. Mr. Edwards caught it and handed it back without a word, but she noticed the concern etched in his features as he studied the worsening storm outside. Another hour passed in tense silence, broken only by Mrs. Harrison's increasingly shrill observations about their predicament. The snow was falling so heavily now that Sarah could barely see the team of horses through the front window. Her fingers, despite her woolen gloves, had grown numb with cold. She found herself writing again. "The world has disappeared into white. It reminds me of Thomas's stories about being lost in the mine, how he said the darkness became so complete that a man could lose himself in it. Is that what's happening now? Are we losing ourselves in all this white?" A sharp crack pierced the howling wind, followed by a sickening lurch. The stagecoach tilted dramatically to one side, sending Sarah's journal sliding across the floor. They came to a bone-jarring stop, and Hank's cursing could be heard clearly now through the hatch. "Wheels broke," he shouted down to them. "Can't go no further like this." Mrs. Harrison burst into tears, while her husband demanded to know what Hank intended to do about their situation. Mr. Edwards folded his newspaper with deliberate calm, though his hands shook slightly. Sarah retrieved her journal, brushing off the snow that had already accumulated on its pages through the coaches. Many drafts. Something in the leather's familiar texture steadied her, even as fear began to curl in her stomach. She knew these plains, knew how quickly the storm could turn deadly. "There's a way station," Hank called down again, "about 2 miles back. We passed it just before the wheel went. If we start now, we might make it before dark." 2 miles. Sarah stared out into the swirling white void, remembering all the stories she'd heard about people getting lost within yards of safety during a blizzard. She clutched her journal to her chest, feeling Thomas's absence like a physical ache. He would have known what to do. He would have kept her safe. But Thomas wasn't here, and as the other passengers began gathering their belongings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, this moment, would change everything. The moment Sarah stepped down from the stagecoach, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Snow stung her face like tiny needles, and her skirts immediately began to tangle around her legs. She clutched Thomas's pocket watch in her gloved hand, its familiar weight offering little comfort as Hank helped the other passengers down. "Stay close together," Hank shouted over the wind. "Follow my lead." They formed a ragged line, Hank in front, then the Harrisons, Mr. Edwards and Sarah bringing up the rear. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and Sarah struggled to keep pace. Her carpet bag grew heavier with each step, but she couldn't bear to leave behind Thomas's letters and her journal. Time became meaningless in the white void. Sarah could barely see the person in front of her. Her world narrowed to the mechanical process of putting one foot in front of the other, fighting for each step. The cold crept through her clothes, despite her layers, and her fingers grew so numb she nearly dropped Thomas's watch. When she stumbled for the 3rd time, the gap between her and Mr. Edwards widened dangerously. "Wait!" she called out, her voice swallowed by the wind. "Please, wait!" She thought she heard voices ahead, but couldn't make out the words. Pushing forward with renewed desperation, Sarah finally glimpsed the others, huddled together, seemingly in argument. "Uday can't keep going at this pace," she heard Mrs. Harrison say as she drew closer. "We'll all freeze to death." "The widow's slowing us down," Mr. Edwards added, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "We'd make better time without her." Sarah's heart froze, colder than the air around her. "Please," she gasped. "I'll try to go faster, I promise." But she could see the decision hardening in their faces. Even Hank, who'd seemed so jovial earlier, wouldn't look at her directly. Only Mr. Harrison showed a flicker of doubt. "We can't just leave her," he protested weakly. But his wife's hand tightened on his arm. "Better one than all of us, Mrs. Harrison hissed. "She's young and strong. She can make it back to the coach and wait there." Sarah's fingers fumbled with Thomas's watch, trying to check the time, to ground herself in something real. The lid sprang open, and in that moment a fierce gust of wind tore it from her grasp. She lunged for it, but the watch disappeared into the swirling snow. When she looked up again, the others were already moving away, their forms growing indistinct in the white darkness. "Wait!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Please don't leave me." But they didn't turn back. Sarah watched in horror as they vanished completely, taking with them any hope of survival. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the snow, the cold immediately biting through her skirts. The pocket watch was gone. Thomas's watch, the one he'd carried into the mine every day, the one that had stopped at the moment of the cave-in. She'd wound it every morning since his death, carrying it close as a way to keep part of him with her. Now it was lost, just like everything else. Reality began to set in. She couldn't stay here. The coach was somewhere behind her, but in which direction? Everything looked the same in the blinding snow. If she chose wrong, she would only wander farther from safety. Sarah forced herself to stand, though her legs shook with cold and exhaustion. The wind had grown even fiercer, if that was possible, cutting through her clothes as if they were made of paper. Her fingers had gone from painful to frighteningly numb. "Mitchell women are made of stern stuff," she whispered her mother's words through chattering teeth. But even Mitchell women couldn't survive long in this cold. Already, a dangerous drowsiness was creeping over her, making her thoughts slow and thick. She thought of her students, of their tearful goodbyes that morning. Had it only been that morning, it felt like a lifetime ago. The Christmas cards they'd made her were in her carpet bag, along with Thomas's letters and her journal. Soon, they would be buried in the snow, along with her body. Sarah took one stumbling step, then another, though she had no idea if she was heading towards safety or deeper into the wilderness. The wind howled around her like a wild thing, and darkness was beginning to gather at the edges of the white void. "Thomas," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I tried to be strong, but I'm so tired." That's when she heard it, so faint, she thought. She might be dreaming, the sound of hoofbeats cutting through the storm. At first, Sarah thought she was hallucinating. The hoofbeats seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the snow-muffled air. But then a dark shape emerged from the white void, a horse and rider moving with deliberate care through the deep snow. She tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. The cold had settled deep in her chest, and even breathing had become difficult. The figure was going to pass her by, just yards away, never knowing she was there. With the last of her strength, Sarah reached into her carpet bag and pulled out her red wool shawl. Her frozen fingers could barely grip the fabric, but she managed to wave it weakly above her head. The horse stopped. The rider turned his head, and for a moment Sarah feared he too would abandon her to the storm. Then the horse changed direction, picking its way carefully toward her. "Ma'am?" The voice was deep, concerned. A man's face appeared above her, shadowed by a snow-crusted hat brim. "Good Lord, what are you doing out here alone?" Sarah tried to explain, but her words slurred together. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and she got her first clear look at him. He was tall, with a weathered face that spoke of long days in the sun, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark blue and intent, taking in her condition with quiet competence. "I'm James Crawford," he said, already shrugging out of his heavy coat. "And you're half frozen." He wrapped the coat around her, and Sarah nearly wept at the immediate warmth. It smelled of leather, horses, and wood smoke, practical things. Surviving things. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather flask. "Whiskey," he explained, holding it to her lips. "Just a sip, to warm you from inside." The liquid burned down her throat, bringing with it a flush of artificial heat. Her thoughts began to clear slightly, enough to feel embarrassed at her situation. "Sarah Mitchell," she managed. "The stagecoach. They left me." Something hardened in James's expression. "They left you? In this?" He glanced at the sky, though there was nothing to see but swirling white. "We can discuss that later. Right now, we need to get you somewhere warm." He gathered up her carpetbag, securing it to his saddle. Then he turned back to her, his manner gentle, but brooking no argument. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse. Think you can stay in the saddle if I hold you?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure of anything anymore. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her, settling her sideways on the horse before mounting behind her. One arm wrapped securely around her waist, while the other held the reins. "My cabin's about 2 miles from here," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Just lean back against me and try to stay awake. Talk to me if you can." The horse moved forward, and Sarah found herself cradled in unexpected safety. James's body, heat seeped through his coat, warming her back, while his arm kept her steady. She tried to focus on the things he'd asked her to tell him, that she was a teacher, heading to her sister's for Christmas, that she'd been recently widowed. "Married?" she asked in return, desperate to keep her mind working. "No, ma'am." There was something in his tone she couldn't quite read. "Just me and my horse out here." The wind was picking up again, but James seemed to know exactly where he was going. His saddlebag knocked against the horse's flank with each step, and Sarah caught glimpses of strange tools and unfamiliar items through its partially open flap. "Almost there," he said after what seemed like hours. "Stay with me, Sarah. That's my cabin just ahead." She peered through the snow and saw a faint yellow glow, lamplight through a window. The sight of it brought tears to her eyes, though they froze almost immediately on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was going to die out there." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Not on my watch, Mum. Not on my watch." As they approached the cabin, Sarah felt consciousness starting to slip away despite her best efforts. The last thing she remembered was James's voice, steady and reassuring in her ear, promising that she was safe now. Then darkness took her and she knew nothing more. Sarah drifted back to consciousness gradually, aware first of warmth, then of unfamiliar smells, wood smoke, coffee, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She was lying on something soft, wrapped in heavy blankets, with a crackling fire nearby. For a moment she thought she was back home, that Thomas would be sitting in his favorite chair when she opened her eyes. But when she did open them, she found herself in a stranger's cabin, the events of the day rushing back with stark clarity. James Crawford stood at a pot-bellied stove, his back to her as he stirred something that smelled wonderfully of herbs and meat. A small movement caught her eye. A wooden horse on a nearby shelf, caught in an eternal gallop. It was beautifully carved, each muscle and sinew detailed with obvious care. Other carvings surrounded it, birds in flight, leaping deer, even a delicate mountain flower. "You're an artist," she said, her voice rough from the cold. James turned, relief evident in his expression. "You're awake." "And no, ma'am, just a man who gets restless during long winter nights." He poured something from the pot into a cup. "Think you can sit up? You need to get something warm inside you." Sarah managed to push herself upright, though her muscles protested every movement. She was still wearing her dress, she noted with relief, though her boots had been removed and set by the fire to dry. James brought her the cup, beef broth, rich and steaming. "Sip it slowly," he advised, settling into a chair nearby. "You were pretty far gone when we got here. Had me worried for a while." She cradled the cup in her still tingling hands, letting its warmth seep into her bones. The cabin was small but neat, with a single room divided by function rather than walls. A bed, the one she currently occupied, stood in one corner, a kitchen area in another, books lined rough-hewn. Shelves, their spines well worn. How long was I unconscious? Couple hours. James got up to add wood to the fire. "Storm's still going strong out there. You'll have to stay put till it passes." The proper thing would be to protest, to worry about propriety, but Sarah was too grateful, too exhausted to pretend. "Thank you," she said instead, "not just for the rescue, but for—" She gestured at the cabin, the broth, everything. He nodded, then reached for something on a high shelf. "Found this clutched in your hand when I brought you in." He held out her journal, slightly damp but intact. "Seemed important to you." Sarah took it gratefully, running her fingers over the familiar leather cover. "It was a gift from my husband. Thomas," the name still caught in her throat sometimes. "He died 6 months ago in a mining accident." James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he studied the fire. "Lost my wife and daughter to fever 8 years back," he said finally. "That's when I came out here, learned to live with the quiet." The admission hung in the air between them, a shared understanding of grief's weight. Sarah sipped her broth, watching as James moved around the cabin with the ease of long habit. There was a grace to him that belied his size, a gentleness in the way he handled everything from cups to kindling. "The carvings," she said, nodding toward the shelf. "They're beautiful. Would you tell me about them?" Something in his face softened. He picked up the wooden horse, turning it in his hands. "This was the first one. Made it the winter after they passed. Needed something to do with my hands besides hold a bottle." He told her about each carving as she finished her broth. The hawk he'd watched for 3 days before getting its wings right, the deer he'd sketched first in his own journal, the flower that grew only on the highest mountain slopes. His voice was low and comfortable, filling the cabin with stories as the storm raged outside. Sarah felt her eyelids growing heavy again, but she fought to stay awake. There was something healing in this moment, in the simple act of sharing stories with another soul who understood loss. The firelight caught the edges of James's profile, softening the weathered lines of his face, and she found herself wondering what other stories he held inside. "Rest," he said, noticing her struggle. "You're safe here, Sarah. Tomorrow's soon enough for more stories." As she drifted off again, Sarah's last conscious thought was that for the first time in 6 months, she felt truly warm. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of wood being worked. The fire had died down to glowing embers, but the cabin remained comfortably warm. James sat in a chair by the hearth, a small knife moving steadily over a piece of wood in his hands. A military medal gleamed dully on the table beside him, catching occasional glints of firelight. "You were in the war," she said quietly, sitting up. His hands stilled, but he didn't look up. "Union cavalry. Served under Sheridan." The knife resumed its steady motion. "Seems like a lifetime ago now." Sarah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and moved to sit in the chair opposite him. Outside, the wind still howled, but it seemed less threatening now, as if the cabin's walls held more than just physical warmth. "Is that why you understand?" she asked. "About loss, I mean. Not just your family, but the war taught me about loss. Losing Rebecca and little Mary taught me about surviving it." He set down his carving, the beginnings of what looked like a small bird, and reached for the medal. "Distinguished Service Cross. They gave it to me for leading a charge that killed 30 men. Some distinction." The bitterness in his voice made Sarah's heart ache. Without thinking, she reached across and touched his hand. "You were protecting something, someone." "Was I?" His fingers curled around hers briefly before letting go. "Spent a long time trying to figure that out. Came out here after Rebecca. And Mary died, thinking the quiet might help. Found out silence has its own kind of noise." He poured coffee for them both, the domestic action at odds with the weight of his words. Sarah accepted the cup, noting the fine tremor in his hands. "Is that when you started carving?" "Yeah." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Rebecca always said I had artist's hands, even when I was just a cavalry officer. Never had time to find out if she was right, until there was nothing but time." Sarah sipped her coffee, letting the comfortable silence stretch between them. James added wood to the fire, and shadows danced across the cabin walls. "Tell me about them?" she asked finally. "Your Rebecca and Mary." For a moment, she thought she'd overstepped. But then James settled back in his chair and began to speak. He told her about Rebecca's laugh, how it could fill a room, about Mary's fascination with horses, how she'd been riding almost before she could walk, about picnics in summer meadows and Christmas mornings, and all the small, precious moments that make up a life. In return, Sarah found herself talking about Thomas, about his gentle hands and quick smile, his dream of starting a small ranch once. He'd saved enough from the mine. About their quiet evenings together, him reading the newspaper while she graded papers at their kitchen table. "He sounds like a good man," James said when she finished. "He was, just like your Rebecca sounds like a wonderful woman." Sarah touched her locket, then made a decision. She opened it, removing the small photograph inside. "Would you like to see him?" James took the photograph carefully, studying Thomas's face in the firelight. "You can see how much he loved you," he said softly. "It's in his eyes." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared understanding that went beyond words. James stood and walked to a trunk in the corner. From it, he withdrew a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. "My girls," he said, handing it to Sarah. Rebecca's face smiled up at her, young Mary perched on her lap, both of them caught in a moment of perfect happiness. "They're beautiful," Sarah whispered. She looked up to find James watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "I think the hardest part isn't losing them. It's learning to let yourself feel something new without feeling like you're betraying their memory." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she met his gaze. "Yes," she said softly, "exactly that." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, something fragile and new was taking root. Neither of them spoke for a long while, but the silence was comfortable, filled with understanding and the first tentative stirrings of possibility. Dawn crept into the cabin slowly, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Sarah woke to find herself still in the chair by the fire, a blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders. The sound of movement in the kitchen area drew her attention to James, who was attempting to make breakfast as quietly as possible. A cracked coffee cup sat waiting on the rough-hewn table, steam rising invitingly. James looked up as she stirred, offering a slightly self-conscious smile. "Hope you like flapjacks. It's about all I can manage that's fit for company." "I'm sure they'll be perfect." Sarah stood, working the stiffness from her neck. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting patterns on the wooden floor. Everything looked different in the daylight, more real, yet somehow more intimate. James had already been outside, his coat hung by the door, dusted with fresh snow. Checked on the horse, gathered some firewood. "Storm's passed, but we've got drifts taller than a man out there. Might be stuck here another day or so." The news should have alarmed her. Proper ladies didn't spend multiple nights unchaperoned in strange men's cabins. But Sarah found herself feeling oddly relieved. She wasn't ready to face the world outside, not yet. "I should help with breakfast," she offered, moving toward the kitchen area. Their hands brushed as she reached for a plate, and both pulled back quickly like startled deer. "Sorry," James mumbled, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, not sorry, just—" He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in endearing disarray. "Been a while since I shared breakfast with anyone." Sarah felt warmth creep into her cheeks. "Me too." She busied herself with setting the table, using the simple task to steady her nerves. The familiarity of domestic routine helped, even if everything else about the situation was unprecedented. They worked around each other in the small space, establishing an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. James managed not to burn the flapjacks, though one or two emerged from the pan in questionable shapes. Sarah found preserves in a cupboard and set them out alongside butter she'd helped him churn from cream he'd stored in the cold room under the cabin. "It's not exactly what you're used to," he apologized, setting down the last plate. "It's wonderful," she assured him, and meant it. The coffee was strong and hot, the flapjacks were filling, and the morning sun made everything glow with possibility. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. Sarah found herself studying James when he wasn't looking, the way his hands dwarfed the coffee cup, the slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated on his food, the way the morning light softened his weathered features. "You're staring," he said quietly without looking up. "I'm observing," she corrected, feeling heat rise in her cheeks again. The teacher in me, I suppose, always studying things. Now he did look up, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "And what are you learning, Mrs. Mitchell?" The formal address struck her oddly. "Sarah," she said, "please, after last night's conversations, I think we're past formalities." Something softened in his expression. "Sarah, then." He stood to clear the plates, then paused. "You never did answer my question. What are you learning?" She helped him carry the dishes to the wash basin, considering her answer. "I'm learning that sometimes the most unexpected situations can feel right, even when they shouldn't." Their hands met in the water as they both reached for the same plate. This time, neither pulled away immediately. Water dripped from their fingers, marking time in the silence that followed. "I know what you mean," James said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I keep thinking I should be more concerned about propriety, about what people might think. But? He turned to face her, water droplets sliding down his forearms. "But all I can think about is how right it feels to have you here, in my home, sharing my morning." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's heart skip. She looked down at their hands, still touching beneath the water's surface. "I feel it too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" Because I'm not sure I'm ready to feel anything this significant again. James nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. We don't have to name it, he said gently. We don't have to do anything but share this morning and maybe see what the day brings. Sarah smiled, grateful for his patience, his understanding. I'd like that, she said, and turned back to the dishes, their shoulders touching as they worked. Together in the growing morning light. After breakfast, Sarah found herself drawn to James's bookshelf while he went to tend to his horse. The collection surprised her. Not just practical guides and almanacs, but poetry, philosophy, and classical literature. Her fingers traced the spine of a well-worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, then stopped at a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. She quickly stepped back, not wanting to pry, but James's voice behind her made her jump. You can look at them if you'd like. He'd returned quietly, snow melting from his boots by the door. They're from my time teaching at West Point. You were a teacher? Sarah turned, surprised. For 3 years after the war. He moved to the shelf and carefully untied the ribbon, selecting one letter. Taught military strategy and mathematics. It wasn't quite the same as your schoolhouse, but you understand the joy of watching someone learn, she finished for him, accepting the letter he offered. The page was filled with elegant mathematical proofs and detailed battle formations, annotated in James's steady hand. He watched her read, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. It was a good time before Rebecca and Mary got sick. I had plans to stay on, maybe work my way up to department head. What happened? After I lost them, the classroom felt too confined. Too many memories of telling Mary about my students, of Rebecca helping me grade papers in the evenings. He took the letter back, handling it with careful reverence. Needed open spaces and simple work to heal. Sarah thought about her own classroom, how teaching had been both burden and salvation after Thomas's death. But you still read, still learn. Mine gets restless same as hands. He smiled slightly. Besides, good books are like good friends. They don't judge your silence. Moving to his desk, James opened a drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio. Inside were sketches, landscapes, animals, and detailed mathematical diagrams sharing space with poetry written in his precise hand. I never would have guessed, Sarah said softly. A cavalry officer who quotes Whitman and solves equations for pleasure. Most don't look past the rough exterior. His voice held no bitterness, just quiet acceptance. Out here, it's easier to be all of who I am without explaining myself. Sarah studied a particularly beautiful sketch of a mountain. Sunrise. Is that why you stay? The freedom to be yourself? Partly. He was quiet for a moment, then added, but lately, I've been wondering if I've been hiding rather than healing. If maybe it's time to what? To let someone see all the pieces again. His eyes met hers, intense and honest. Someone who might understand. The air between them grew thick with unspoken possibilities. Sarah found herself thinking of her own journal, of all the thoughts and feelings she'd kept locked away since Thomas's death. It's scary, she admitted, being seen that clearly again. Terrifying, he agreed with a soft laugh. Then, hesitantly, would you like to see my favorite spot to sketch? It's just behind the cabin. We wouldn't have to go far. Sarah glanced at her now dry boots by the fire. I'd like that very much. They bundled up against the cold, James insisting she wear his spare coat. The world outside was transformed. Every branch and fence post wore a coating of crystalline snow that sparkled in the morning sun. James led her around the cabin to a small rise, where a fallen log provided a natural seat with a view of the valley below. It's beautiful, Sarah breathed, taking in the pristine landscape. It is now, James said quietly, but when she turned to look at him, he was watching her rather than the view. A snowflake had landed on her cheek, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away before brushing it off with his thumb. The touch lingered, gentle and warm against her cold skin. Sarah found herself leaning into it slightly, her heart racing. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and even more surprising was the realization that she wanted him to. Instead, he dropped his hand and took a small step back, respecting the boundary they both knew was still there. But something had shifted between them, a door opened that couldn't quite be closed again. "Tell me about your favorite book," she said, breaking the charged silence. His smile was immediate and grateful as they settled on the log, and soon they were deep in discussion about literature and learning, poetry and philosophy, while the winter sun climbed higher in the crystal-clear sky. By afternoon, the sky had turned treacherous again. James stood at the window, studying the gathering clouds with a frown that deepened the lines around his eyes. An old broken lantern sat on the windowsill, its glass cracked but still catching what remained of the daylight. "Another storm's coming," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Bigger than the last one, by the look of those clouds." Sarah joined him at the window, acutely aware of his presence beside her. The pristine landscape they'd admired that morning now seemed ominous, the snow-laden branches bowing under their frozen burden. "How long?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. 3, maybe 4 days. He turned to face her, conflict evident in his expression. "Sarah, I know this isn't proper, but I can't let you leave before it passes. The temperature's dropping fast, and the wind's already shifting." As if to emphasize his point, a gust rattled the window panes. The lantern wobbled, and James steadied it automatically, his hand brushing against hers as she reached for it at the same time. "It belonged to my father," he explained, fingers lingering on the cracked glass. "Carried it through 2 wars. Stopped. A bullet once. Saved his life." He smiled slightly. "Doesn't work anymore, but I keep it to remind me that broken things still have value." Sarah understood the deeper meaning in his words. They were both broken in their own ways, carrying scars that might never fully heal. Yet here they were, finding unexpected worth in each other's company. "I should check our supplies," James said, moving toward the storage area. "Been a while since I had to provide for 2. Sarah followed, wanting to help, to feel useful. The root cellar beneath the cabin's floor revealed rows of preserved vegetables, cured meats, and other staples. But as James took inventory, his frown returned. "Flour's lower than I thought," he muttered, "and we're down to our last coffee beans." "We'll manage," Sarah assured him, though the thought of days confined together sent her pulse racing. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can make anything stretch if needed." James paused in his counting, looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You're something else, Sarah Mitchell. Most women would be fretting about their reputation. Right now, most women haven't been through what we have." She met his gaze steadily. "Somehow, propriety seems less important than survival." "Is that all this is?" His voice was soft. "Survival?" Before she could answer, a violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin. They hurried upstairs to find snow already beginning to fall, thick flakes driving sideways past the windows. James immediately began preparing the cabin for the siege, bringing in extra firewood, checking the shutters, laying out emergency supplies. Sarah helped where she could, their movements around each other now practiced and familiar. As darkness fell, the storm's fury increased. They sat before the fire, sharing a simple supper of beans and cornbread, listening to the winds howl. The lantern sat between them on the table, its broken glass throwing strange shadows on the walls. "I should be terrified," Sarah said quietly. "Trapped in a remote cabin with a man I barely know, days away from any help. But instead, I feel safe," James suggested when she trailed off. "Yes, safe. And something else I'm not ready to name." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We don't have to name it." "But Sarah," he hesitated, then continued, "whatever this is, these days together, I want you to know it means something. You mean something." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, time seemed to slow. Sarah looked at James across the broken lantern, at the way the firelight softened his features, at the gentleness in his weathered hands as he broke off a piece of cornbread. "I know," she whispered. I feel it too. The admission hung between them, as delicate and dangerous as the storm clouds gathering overhead. They sat in companionable silence as the evening deepened, each lost in thought while the wind sang its wild song around the cabin's walls. The next morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, it had intensified, forcing them into the intimate confines of the cabin's central room. Sarah woke to find James had slept in his chair by the fire, a patchwork quilt drawn up to his chest, his face softened in sleep. She watched him for a moment, struck by how vulnerable he looked. The hardened cavalry officer, the solitary rancher, all those layers stripped away by sleep, leaving just the man. A lock of hair had fallen across his forehead, and her fingers itched to brush it back. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she rose, and James's eyes opened instantly, alert despite his peaceful appearance moments before. "Good morning," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Hope I didn't snore." "Like a gentleman," she assured him with a small smile. They moved around each other in the morning routine they'd established, sharing the wash basin, preparing coffee, their domestic dance made closer by the storm's confinement. The quilt lay forgotten on James's chair until Sarah picked it up to fold. "This is beautiful work," she said, admiring the intricate pattern. "Your wife's. Rebecca's mother's." He touched the fabric gently. "Wedding gift. Rebecca always said. It was too fine to use, kept it stored away for special occasions. After they died, I started using it every day. Seemed wrong to keep something so full of love locked up in a trunk." Sarah ran her fingers over the stitches, thinking of her own hope chest back home, full of things she'd been saving for some imagined future that never came. Thomas used to tease me about that, saving things for someday. He'd say life was too short for unused china and wrapped-up memories. Wise man. James stepped closer, his hand joining hers on the quilt. Sarah, the air between them, crackled with unspoken words. They were standing too close now, the quilt a tenuous barrier between them. Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the lingering scent of wood smoke on his clothes. "We should check the supplies," she said quickly, stepping back. "Make sure we have enough to wait out the storm." James let her retreat, though something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment? Relief? They spent the morning taking inventory, their conversations safely focused on practical matters. But in the confined space, every accidental touch, every shared glance felt charged with meaning. By afternoon, the storm had driven them back to the fire. James worked on a new carving while Sarah wrote in her journal, but she found herself watching his hands more than focusing on her words. He handled the knife with the same gentle strength she'd noticed in everything he did, coaxing form from formless wood with patient skill. "What are you writing?" he asked, not looking up from his work. Sarah glanced down at her journal, at the words that had flowed unbidden onto the page. "About the storm. She hesitated. "About how strange it is, feeling so at peace in the middle of such chaos." Now he did look up, his eyes meeting hers across the space between their chairs. "Nothing strange about finding shelter in a storm, Sarah. We both know I'm not just talking about the weather." The knife stilled in his hands. A piece of wood shaving fell to the floor, curling like a question mark at his feet. "No," he said softly. "I suppose you're not." Sarah closed her journal, her heart thundering in her chest. "James, I don't know how to do this, how to feel this way again without feeling like I'm betraying Thomas's memory. You think I don't wonder the same thing?" He set aside his carving, leaning forward in his chair. "Every time I look at you, every time I think about what's growing between us, I hear Rebecca's laugh in my head. But then I remember something she told me once when we were talking about her mother's death. She said the heart doesn't have a limited supply of love. It grows to hold what it needs to hold." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks dancing between them. Sarah found herself moving to the edge of her chair, drawn by the quiet conviction in his voice. "And what does your heart need to hold, James Crawford?" "Hope," he whispered. "For the first time in 8 years, it needs to hold hope." The sound jolted them both, a desperate, pained whinny cutting through the storm's howl. James was on his feet instantly, reaching for his coat. "That's thunder! Something's wrong!" Sarah grabbed her own coat before he could protest. "I'm coming with you." Their eyes met briefly, understanding passing between them. His horse was more than just an animal to him. It was family. The bitter cold hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside. The snow was nearly waist-deep, and James broke trail toward the stable, Sarah following in his footsteps. Her wedding ring, which had always fit perfectly, felt suddenly tight in the cold. They found Thunder thrashing in his stall, one leg caught in a broken floorboard. The horse's eyes rolled white with panic, and James approached him with quiet words, his voice steady despite the fear Sarah could see in his face. "Easy, boy. Easy now." He reached for Thunder's halter, but the horse jerked away, nearly trampling him. "Sarah, I need your help. Talk to him while I try to free his leg." She moved forward without hesitation, placing herself near Thunder's head. The massive animal towered over her, but she kept her voice calm, drawing on years of experience with the horses her father had raised. "You're all right, beautiful boy," she crooned, slowly reaching for his nose. "We're here to help. That's it. Easy now." Thunder's panic began to ease under her gentle touch. James worked quickly but carefully, assessing the trapped leg. "Board's splintered. Need to break it away without cutting him. There's a crowbar by the door." Sarah found it and returned, never stopping her soft stream of comfort to the horse. Together, they worked to free Thunder's leg, their movements coordinated as if they'd done this 100 times before. When the board finally gave way, Sarah's wedding ring caught on a splinter, pulling free from her finger. "Got him," James announced, running his hands over Thunder's leg, checking for serious injury. "Just some scrapes, thank God. Sarah, you're bleeding." She looked down to find a small cut on her hand where the ring had torn free. More distressing was the sight of the ring itself, lying half buried in the straw and snow. James spotted it too and retrieved it carefully. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and neither pulled away immediately. Thunder nickered softly beside them, as if sensing the charged moment. "It's always felt like a part of me," Sarah said, looking at the ring in her palm. "But just now, when we were helping Thunder, I didn't even notice it was gone until after." James's hand was still touching hers, warm despite the stable's chill. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying," she took a deep breath, watching it cloud in the cold air. "I'm saying that maybe some things need to be let go before we can hold something new." Thunder chose that moment to stamp his injured leg, bringing them back to the present crisis. They cleaned and bandaged his wounds, working together with the same unspoken understanding they'd shown during the rescue. Only when they were sure he was comfortable did they allow themselves to feel the cold and exhaustion. Back in the cabin, James built up the fire while Sarah found clean cloths to bandage her hand. He knelt beside her chair as she worked, gently taking over when she struggled with the bandage. "You were amazing out there," he said, his fingers lingering on her wrist. "Most city women would have panicked. I'm not most women." She watched him tie off the bandage with careful precision. "No," he agreed softly, "you're not." His hand moved to cup her cheek, and this time neither of them pulled away. "Sarah." Her heart thundered in her chest as she leaned into his touch. The ring lay on the table beside them, no longer on her finger for the first time in 7 years. Everything felt poised on a knife's edge, the storm outside, the warmth within, the way James looked at her as if she were something precious and new. "James," she whispered. And then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing certainty. She melted into the kiss, into the strength of him, into the rightness of this moment they'd been moving toward since he first found her in the storm. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Sarah saw her own wonder reflected in James's eyes. Outside, the wind sang through the trees, but here in this space they'd created, everything was still, peaceful and full of possibility. Evening settled over the cabin like a gentle hand, bringing with it a different kind of quiet. Sarah sat at James's desk, watching him tend the fire, everything familiar, yet somehow new. Her fingers traced the edge of a piece of sheet music she'd found earlier, yellowed with age, but clearly well-loved. It was Mary's, James said, noticing her interest. She was learning piano before. He cleared his throat. Rebecca used to play this for her every night before bed. What's the song? Beautiful Dreamer. Not very practical for a ranch, I suppose, but I've kept meaning to get a piano. Just never found the right time. Sarah looked at the notes on the page, remembering her own mother at their parlor piano. I could play it for you someday, she offered softly, if you'd like. The word someday hung between them, full of promise. James crossed to the desk, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. I'd like that very much. She reached up to cover his hand with hers, and he drew her to her feet, pulling her gently into his arms. They stood like that for a long moment, swaying slightly to music only they could hear. Dance with me, he whispered against her hair. There's no music. I'll make some. And to her amazement, he began to hum Beautiful Dreamer, his deep voice carrying the melody with surprising sweetness. Sarah closed her eyes and let him guide her in a slow waltz around the cabin's main room. As they danced, memories swirled like snow in her mind. Thomas teaching her to waltz before their wedding, her students practicing their steps at the harvest social, her mother insisting that every proper lady should know how to dance. But these memories no longer brought pain, only a gentle acceptance that they were part of who she was, who she had become. James's humming faded, but they continued to move together, comfortable in the silence. When Sarah finally opened her eyes, she found him watching her with such tenderness that her heart seemed to skip. What are you thinking? She asked. That I never expected to feel this way again. His hand tightened slightly at her waist, that maybe we were both lost in that storm for a reason. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. I'm not lost anymore. This time when they kissed, it was unhurried, deep with understanding and growing certainty. James's hands remained gentle on her waist, but Sarah could feel the restrained power in them, the careful way he held himself in check. When they parted, both slightly breathless, a log popped in the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. The sound broke the spell, reminding them of the practical world beyond their embrace. I should check on Thunder, James said reluctantly. Sarah nodded, stepping back, though her body protested the distance. I'll make us some tea. They moved around, each other in the cabin's small space, their domestic routine now charged with new awareness. Every accidental touch, every shared glance carried the weight of possibility. When James returned, bringing a blast of cold air with him, Sarah had the tea ready. They settled in their chairs by the fire, closer now than before, their knees almost touching. The storm's starting to ease, he said, accepting the cup she offered. Might be able to get you back to town in a day or two. Sarah heard the question in his voice, the uncertainty. James, she set down her tea and reached for his hand. When we do get back, when people talk, and they will talk, I know. His fingers interlaced with hers. I should care more about that, I suppose. About propriety and reputation. But Sarah, the only thing I care about is what you want, what you need. She thought about her students, her teaching position, all the careful structures of her life in town. Then she thought about the peace she'd found here, the way James looked at her as if she were both precious and strong. I want this, she said simply. Whatever comes with it, whatever people say, I want to see where this leads. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture both courtly and deeply intimate. Outside, the wind's howl had softened to a whisper, as if nature itself approved of their choice. They sat together in comfortable silence, drinking their tea, while the fire painted golden patterns on the walls and their future slowly took shape in the warmth between them. Morning brought with it a notice, half buried in snow by James's front door. He found it while clearing a path to the stable, the paper soggy but still legible. Sarah watched his expression change as he read it, standing in the doorway with her. shawl pulled tight against the cold. "What is it?" He handed her the notice, jaw tight. "Search parties, they're looking for you." Sarah's eyes scanned the paper, taking in the details. The town had organized volunteers, concerned when she hadn't arrived at her sister's. They'd already found the abandoned stagecoach, and the other passengers had been rescued. All of them, spinning tales about how she'd chosen to stay behind, how they'd tried to convince her to come with them. "They're lying," she whispered, anger coloring her voice. "They left me to die." James took the notice from her trembling hands. "We'll set the record straight. Make sure everyone knows what really happened." But Sarah wasn't listening. The reality of the world beyond the cabin came crashing in. Her teaching position, her reputation, her carefully built life in town. What will people say? A widow spending days alone with a man she barely knows. "Sarah." James's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, finding strength in his steady gaze. "What happened here? What's happening? Between us, it's real, it's honest. Anyone who'd twist that into something ugly isn't worth your concern." "My students," she said softly, "their parents, will know that you survived because of God's grace and human kindness. Nothing more, nothing less." He touched her cheek. Unless what? Unless you want there to be more. Unless you want to face whatever comes next, together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah thought of their dance the night before, of the peace she'd found in his arms. But she also thought of Thomas's family in town, of the gossips at church, of the school board's strict moral requirements for teachers. "I need some air," she said abruptly, stepping past him into the snow. The cold helped clear her head as she walked to the stable to check on Thunder. The horse nickered a greeting, his injured leg healing well. She stroked his nose, finding comfort in the simple action. "What would you do," she asked the horse softly, "if you found something precious and unexpected, but claiming it meant risking everything you've built?" "Horses usually just follow. Und their hearts," James's voice came from behind her. "They're smarter than humans that way." She turned to find him leaning against the stable door, snow dusting his shoulders. He looked solid, real, everything she didn't know she needed until the storm brought them together. "I'm not ashamed of what's growing between us," she said carefully, "but I'm afraid. Not just of what people will say, but of how much I feel, how quickly. It's like standing on the edge of something vast, knowing that once I step forward, everything changes." James crossed to her slowly, as if approaching a spooked colt. "Everything's already changed, Sarah. The moment I found you in that storm, the moment you helped me with Thunder, the moment we first kissed. We've been changing, growing, healing together. And if it all falls apart, if the talk becomes too much, if we discover we only worked in this bubble of storm and solitude," he took her hands in his, warming them between his palms, "then we'll face that too, together. I'm not asking for promises, Sarah. Just a chance to see where this road leads." She looked down at their joined hands, thinking of her wedding ring, lying on the cabin's table where she'd left it. "My sister will be worried sick. We'll send word as soon as the weather allows. Let her know you're safe." The school board meets next week to discuss spring term contracts. "And you'll be there, head held high, ready to tell the truth about what happened." Sarah studied his face, seeing the same certainty there that she'd noticed when he'd first found her in the storm. "You really aren't afraid of any of this, are you?" "Oh, I'm terrified," he admitted with a small smile, "but not of loving you. Never of that." The word love sent warmth spreading through her chest, melting the last of her icy fear. She stepped into his embrace, fitting against him as naturally as if they'd been doing this for years instead of days. "Together, then," she whispered against his chest. His arms tightened around her, and in the quiet of the stable, with Thunder as their only witness, they held each other and let the future unfold as it would, while helping James organize supplies for their eventual journey into town. Sarah discovered the photograph in an old trunk. It had slipped behind some books, preserved in a simple wooden frame, much like the one holding the picture of his wife and daughter. But this image showed a younger James in his cavalry uniform, standing beside a man who could have been his twin. "I see you've found Benjamin." James's voice came from behind her, heavy with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "Your brother?" Sarah asked, studying the identical features of the two men in the photograph. "My twin." James sat heavily in his chair by the fire. "He died at Gettysburg, under my command." Sarah placed the photograph carefully on the table and moved to his side. "You never mentioned having a twin." "There's a lot I haven't mentioned, Sarah, things I should have told you before. Before us." He stared into the fire, his face shadowed. "I wasn't just any cavalry officer. I was in command of a special unit. We did things, necessary things for the Union, but things that haunt me still." Sarah waited, sensing he needed to tell this story in his own way. "Benjamin and I enlisted together, rose through the ranks together. When they gave me command of the unit, he insisted on serving under me instead of taking his own command elsewhere." James's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "The mission that killed him, I gave the order. Sent him and 12 other men into what I knew was probably a trap, because we needed the intelligence." "You were at war," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes there are no good choices." "The official report called it a successful mission. Said the intelligence we gained saved hundreds of lives." His laugh was bitter. "They gave me a medal for it. A medal for sending my own brother to his death." Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. "Is that why you came out here? To punish yourself?" "Partly. Losing Rebecca and Mary so soon after. It felt like judgment, like payment coming due for all the lives I'd taken or sacrificed." He turned to look at her, his eyes haunted. "You should know who I am, Sarah, what I've done, before you decide about us." She thought about Thomas, about how clean and simple his death had been, tragic but straightforward, a mining accident with no moral complexity. What James carried was different, heavier, layered with responsibility and choice. "Show me," she said. "Show you what?" "Everything. The medal, your journals from that time, anything you've kept. Help me understand." For a long moment he just looked at her. Then he rose and went to the trunk, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside lay his distinguished service cross, military papers, and a leather-bound journal worn with age. Together, they read through his war accounts, not just of Benjamin's last mission, but of all the difficult decisions, the weights carried, the costs counted. Sarah watched James's face as much as the words, seeing how each memory still cut deep. "After Benjamin died," he said finally, "I started carving. Little things at first, trying to keep my hands busy at night when the memories were worst. He was always the artistic one, used to sketch everything he saw. I guess I was trying to keep part of him alive." Sarah looked at the carvings around the cabin with new understanding. Each one was a piece of healing, a way of turning pain into beauty, just as he'd done with his grief for Rebecca and Mary. "You think this changes how I feel?" she asked quietly. "Doesn't it? Knowing I sacrificed my own brother, that I carry all this darkness?" Sarah stood and walked to the shelf of carvings, picking up the wooden horse he'd shown her that first night. "This isn't darkness, James. This is what you did with the darkness. You took it and turned it into something beautiful." She placed the carving in his hands. "Just like you did with your grief for Rebecca and Mary. Just like you're helping me do with my grief for Thomas." "Sarah," his voice broke on her name. She knelt before him again, taking his face between her hands. "We all carry things, James. What matters is what we do with them. And you take broken things and find the beauty in them. How could I not love you for that?" The words slipped out naturally, inevitably, and Sarah felt no desire to take it back. James pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as if she were an anchor in a storm. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "God help me. I love you so much." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. sending rays of light through the cabin windows. Like grace, Sarah thought, like forgiveness, like hope. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day they decided to return to town. James checked his compass twice before securing it to his belt, though he knew these trails well enough to ride them blindfolded. Still, with precious cargo like Sarah, he wouldn't take chances. Sarah stood in the cabin doorway, watching him prepare Thunder for the journey. She'd put her wedding ring back on, but now it rode on a chain around her neck, not hidden, but transformed into something new, a memory rather than a bond. "Ready?" James asked, leading Thunder to the cabin. She took one last look at the space that had changed everything. The carved animals on their shelves, the shared quilt draped over James's chair, the desk where they'd read poetry together. Almost. Moving deliberately, she took Thomas's pocket watch from her carpet bag, the one they'd never found in the snow. She placed it carefully on the mantel, alongside James's military medal. "For remembrance," she said softly, "and for letting go." James touched the watch gently, understanding in his eyes. "We'll come back," he promised, "whenever you need to." The morning air bit sharp and clean as they set out, Sarah seated in front of James on Thunder's broad back. The horse's injured leg had healed well, and he moved surely through the packed snow. James kept one arm around Sarah's waist, the other on the reins, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind. They rode in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of what awaited them in town. The sun climbed higher, making the snow-covered landscape glitter like diamond dust. After about an hour, they crested a hill, and Sarah caught her first glimpse of familiar buildings in the distance. "Nervous?" James asked, feeling her tense slightly. "A little." She leaned back against his chest. "Not about us. About facing them, the ones who left me there to die." His arm tightened protectively around her. "We'll face them together. Make sure everyone knows the truth. And if they don't believe us, then we'll build something new, somewhere else if we have to." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I meant what I said back there. I love you, Sarah Mitchell. Everything else is just details." She smiled, covering his hand with hers. "James Crawford, I do believe you're a romantic under all that stoic exterior. Only for you, Mom. Only for you." They were about a mile from town when they heard hoofbeats approaching. James tensed, but it was only Billy Thompson, one of Sarah's older students, out checking fence lines for his father. The boy's eyes went wide at the sight of them. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've been searching everywhere. Pa's got half the town out looking. Still," and he broke off, finally registering how she was seated with James, the obvious intimacy of their position. Sarah straightened, teacher mode taking over naturally. "Billy, I need you to ride into town and let everyone know I'm safe. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." He wheeled his horse around, then paused. "Mrs. Mitchell, those others from the stagecoach? They said you chose to stay behind, but Joey Cooper's pa said that didn't sound like you at all." "No," she said firmly. "It doesn't, and I'll be telling the whole truth of it soon enough." Billy nodded, looking relieved, then spurred his horse toward town. Sarah and James watched him go, knowing their quiet time together was about to end. "He'll tell everyone he saw us together," Sarah said. "Good." James's voice was steady. "Let them know right from the start. No hiding, no shame." They rode on, the town growing larger before them. Sarah could already imagine the reactions. The scandalmonger's whispers, the proper lady's disapproval, the school board's concerned frowns. But she could also imagine the possibilities. James's carvings selling in the general store, a piano in their home, students learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also about courage and second chances. "James, when you said we could build something new, did you mean that?" "Every word." She turned slightly in the saddle to see his face. "Good, because I have some ideas about teaching more than just schoolbook lessons. About building something that matters." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise. "Tell me," he said. And she did, their quiet conversation carrying them the rest of the way toward whatever waited ahead. The town hall meeting hadn't been planned, But news of Sarah's return spread quickly enough that Mayor Jenkins called one. Anyway, the ledger where he recorded town meetings lay open on his desk as people filed in, their whispers filling the room like rustling leaves. Sarah sat in the front row, James beside her, his presence steady and grounding. She changed into a fresh dress at her house, but insisted on wearing his coat over it, a silent statement about where she stood. The Harrisons were there, along with Mr. Edwards, all three steadfastly avoiding her gaze. They'd cleaned up. Well after their own ordeal, Mrs. Harrison's fur-trimmed collar and her husband's polished boots, showing no sign of their time in the storm. "Order, please," Mayor Jenkins called, bringing the murmurs to a halt. "We're here to address the matter of the abandoned stagecoach and subsequent events." Sarah felt James tense beside her as Mrs. Harrison rose to speak first. "We've already given our account," she said, her voice brittle. "Mrs. Mitchell chose to remain with the coach. We urged her to come with us, but she insisted she'd rather wait for help. We can hardly be blamed for her poor judgment." A low rumble of discontent ran through the crowd. Sarah stood, her voice clear and steady. "That's a lie, and you know it." She moved to the front of the room, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. The town ledger sat open on the mayor's desk, and she placed her hand on it, as if drawing strength from the recorded history of her community. "I was not given a choice. They left me there, knowing I couldn't keep up, knowing what that meant in such weather. If James Crawford hadn't found me," she let the implication hang in the air. "Convenient, isn't it?" Mrs. Harrison sneered. "Being rescued by a handsome stranger, spending days alone with him." "Mary," Mr. Harrison touched his wife's arm, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should what, George? Accept this. This fiction? We all know what really happened here?" "Yes," came a new voice. "We do." Mr. Cooper, Emma's father, stood up. "We know Sarah Mitchell, know her character, her heart. She's taught our children, shared our griefs, celebrated our joys. If she says you abandoned her, I believe her." Others began to stand, parents of her students, neighbors who'd brought food after Thomas's death, people who'd known her since she first came to town as a bright-eyed new bride. "The tracks told the truth," Sheriff Anderson added, his weathered face grave. 5 sets leading away from the coach, no discussion marks in the snow. They just walked away, leaving you to die. The mayor picked up his pen, dipped it in ink. "Let it be recorded that Mrs. Sarah Mitchell was abandoned without consent by her fellow passengers, who then attempted to conceal their actions through false testimony." Mrs. Harrison sputtered in protest, but her husband silenced her with a sharp look. Mr. Edwards stared at his hands, shame evident in his posture. "As for the other matter," the mayor continued, glancing at where James sat, "this town has no right to judge 2 good people finding happiness after loss. The school board agrees. Your contract for the spring term is renewed, Mrs. Mitchell, if you still want it." Sarah felt tears threatening but held them back. "I do, but I'd like to propose some changes. This experience has taught me that there's more to learn than what's in books. If Mr. Crawford is willing, I'd like to add practical lessons, survival, skills, animal care, perhaps even some basic carving." She looked at James, who nodded, a smile touching his lips. "Get it in writing," the mayor said, pushing the ledger toward her. "Make it official." Sarah picked up the pen, feeling its weight, like destiny in her hand. As she wrote, she was aware of movement in the room. The Harrisons slipping out, other townspeople coming forward to welcome James, to express their relief at her safe return. When she finished, James was at her side. Together, they watched. The ink dry on the page, not just a teaching contract now, but a blueprint for something new, something they would build together. "Well," Mayor Jenkins said, closing the ledger with a satisfied thump, "I believe there's still time to get you to your sisters for what's left of Christmas, Mrs. Mitchell, unless you have other plans." Sarah looked up at James, seeing her future in his eyes. "Actually," she said, "I think I'm already exactly where I need to be." Spring came early that year, turning the snow-covered plains to carpets of wildflowers. Sarah sat at her desk in the schoolhouse, writing in a fresh journal while morning light streamed through the windows. The same light caught the gold band. On her finger, not Thomas's ring, which still hung around her neck, but a new one carved by James from a band of silver and inscribed with a simple promise, "From storm to sanctuary." The classroom looked different now. Alongside the traditional alphabet cards and mathematics charts hung James's carvings, birds and animals that helped the children learn about the world beyond their books. A small workbench stood in the corner, where he taught the older students basic carving techniques every Friday afternoon. She smiled, remembering Emma Cooper's delight at completing her first wooden bird last week. "Look, Mrs. Crawford, it's flying!" The name still felt new, though they'd married just as the last. Snow melted. A quiet ceremony in the cabin that had brought them together, witnessed by Sarah's sister Catherine and a few close friends. They'd moved her things there gradually, books finding spaces between her mother's quilt lying easy beside Rebecca's, mother's on their bed, Thomas's watch still keeping company with James's medal on the mantel. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. James rode up on Thunder, who had fully recovered from his injury and now helped teach the children about horse care. He carried something large wrapped in canvas. "Special delivery," he called out as she met him at the door. Together they unwrapped the package, revealing a small piano. "How did you—" "Found it in Cheyenne. Had it restored." He ran a hand along the polished wood. "Thought it was time for beautiful Dreamer to have proper accompaniment." Sarah touched the keys reverently, thinking of Mary learning to play, of Rebecca's nightly concerts. "It's perfect. Thought we could put it in that corner." James nodded toward the space they'd deliberately left empty. "Unless you'd rather have it." "At home? No, here is right. The children should have music." She looked up at him, love swelling in her heart. "Everything about this is right." The first students would arrive soon, but for now, they had this quiet moment. James drew her into his arms, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the morning light paint patterns on the schoolhouse floor. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "About staying, about any of it?" Sarah thought about the path that had led them here, the storm that nearly killed her, the cabin that sheltered them, the love that had grown as naturally as spring flowers after winter's frost. She thought about Thomas, about Rebecca, and Mary, about how grief could carve spaces in the heart that love could fill in new ways. "Only one," she said, smiling up at him, "that we can't show the Harrisons how happy we are. They left town 2 days after the meeting." James chuckled, the sound rich and warm. "Probably for the best, though I'd like to think we taught them something about judgment and mercy." Speaking of teaching, Sarah nodded toward the window, where they could see their students approaching. "Along the dirt road. Ready for today's lesson?" "Always." He kissed her softly, then stepped back to help her prepare the classroom. They worked together with practiced ease, setting out carving tools and drawing supplies alongside spelling, primers and arithmetic books. Sarah opened the piano, letting morning light warm its keys. Later, she would teach her students Beautiful Dreamer, and the melody would float across the prairie like a prayer of thanksgiving. As the first children tumbled in, their voices bright with morning cheer, Sarah caught James's eye and saw her. Own joy reflected them. They had built something new here, not just a marriage or a teaching philosophy, but a way of weaving past and present together, of finding beauty in broken things, of turning storm into sanctuary. Emma Cooper paused at Sarah's desk, laying down a fresh-picked wildflower. "It's going to be a wonderful day, isn't it, Mrs. Crawford?" Sarah touched the flower's delicate petals, then reached for James's hand. "Yes, dear one," she said, knowing. It was both answer and promise. "Every day is wonderful now."